Colin Marsh died in the fire. He didn't even have time to wake up. 3 sleepless nights had taken their toll. The wiring in the old workshop had short-circuited somewhere behind the wall. The flames spread through the wooden shelves faster than he could have opened his eyes. The last thing he felt was the heat on his face and the smell of burning oil. His last thought wasn't about himself. He thought of the sword. The Sengoku-era blade lay on the workbench 3 steps away. 400 years of history. 3 weeks of his work. He hoped someone would think to carry the sword out. Then everything went black. Then it grew cold. Then he opened his eyes and saw a ceiling of soot-stained stone. It smelled of coal and iron scale. It smelled like a blacksmith's shop, but not his own. His workshop in Portland smelled of machine oil and coffee. Here, it smelled like a living history museum. Like those reenactment smithies where he used to go for seminars. Only more intense. The real thing. He tried to sit up and realized that this wasn't his body. The hands were thinner, the shoulders narrower. The fingers were long but without calluses, without burns. Without that scar on his left index finger where, at 19, he'd missed with a chisel. These were someone else's hands. Young hands. He looked at them and didn't recognize them. Then he heard a sound, a wet crunch and a clang. Metal was breaking. He turned his head and saw the quenching bath. Lying in it were 2 pieces of what, a second ago, had been a sword. The blade had cracked right down the middle. The water in the bath was still bubbling. Standing over the bath was a huge man with hands like blacksmiths' tongs. His face was red. His eyes were wild. His mouth was open, but no sound had come yet. Colin knew a sound was coming, and it would be loud. The man roared. He couldn't make out the words, partly because his head was buzzing, partly because the man was roaring so loudly that the walls were shaking. But he caught the general gist. This sword was his last chance. This apprentice was a botcher and a disgrace. This apprentice was unworthy of the hammer. The man grabbed the shards from the tub and hurled them onto the floor in front of Colin. Water splashed from them onto his face. Cold. He blinked. He looked at the shards, and his first thought wasn't about the scream or the fear. His first thought was professional. The fracture was uneven. The grain was coarse, visible to the naked eye. Someone had forged this blank too quickly and at too high a temperature. The carbon was distributed unevenly. The center was softer than the edges. And then that someone had plunged the blank into cold water. Not into oil, not into a warm solution. Into ice-cold water. Steel of this type doesn't tolerate thermal shock. It cracks. And it did crack. Colin looked at the man, then at the shards, then back at the man. The man called him by name. Colin. That was his name too. Coincidence or not? The man said he had a week. 1 week to prove he wasn't a complete failure. If in a week he didn't show at least something worthwhile, he could pack his things and head out onto the street. Colin nodded. Not because he was afraid, because he needed time. The man turned and left. Laughter could be heard from behind the door. Several voices, young, angry. Someone said that Marsh had finally gotten what was coming to him. Someone said it was surprising how long he'd lasted. Someone offered to help him pack his things right away. The laughter grew louder. Then the voices faded away. Colin was left alone. He sat down on the floor next to the debris and began to think. So, he was dead. That was a fact. He was in someone else's body. That was also a fact. The body was young, about 18. It was weak and skinny. His arms weren't trained. He was in a blacksmith shop, a real blacksmith shop, with a coal fire and bellows, with an anvil. He looked at the anvil more closely, and his breath caught in his throat. a pattern on the surface. Thin, wavy lines. He'd seen something like this only twice in his life. In photographs of meteorite iron and on a 10th century Swedish blade he'd restored for a private collector. The anvil was made of meteorite iron. He stood up, walked over, ran his fingers over the surface. Cold, smooth. Thousands of blows had polished it to a mirror finish. He felt something inside him tighten. Not fear, not longing. Something like hunger. He had been working with metal for 27 years. First in his father's garage, then in college, then in his own workshop. He restored swords for museums. He brought blades 300 and 500 years old back to life. He knew metal as a surgeon knows the body, by its sound, by its color, by how it behaves under the hammer. And now he stood in a forge that any restorer from his world would sell his soul to see. A coal-fired forge. A meteorite anvil. Handcrafted tools. Not a single electric appliance. Not a single compromise. He stepped out into the courtyard. The sun was blinding. The courtyard was small, surrounded by a stone wall. A pile of slag lay against the wall. Opposite it stood a 2-story house with a leaky roof. Laundry hung drying on a line. Somewhere beyond the wall, hammers clanged. More forges. He sat down on the pile of slag. The stones dug into the skinny backside of his new body. He looked at his new hands. Long fingers. Not a single callus. This guy clearly didn't bother himself with work. Colin smiled. For the first time since waking up. He had a week. He had an anvil made of meteorite iron. He had a whole world that, by all appearances, didn't know what proper heat treatment was. He was scared. He was confused. But his hands were already itching to get to work. He stood up and walked back into the forge. The first thing he needed to do was examine the tools, to understand what he was working with, to understand what kind of steel this was, to understand the rules of this world. And then he'd repair that cracked sword. Because for 27 years, Colin Marsh had been repairing what others considered dead. And the shards on the smithy floor didn't look dead. They looked wronged. For the first 2 days, Colin didn't forge anything. He studied. It was difficult. His body begged him to act, but his head told him to wait. He walked around the forge 3 times. He examined every tool. He touched every piece of raw metal on the rack. He sniffed the coal. He tested the bellows. The left bellows creaked and delivered air in jerks. The right one worked smoothly, but the leather on it was old and leaked in 2 places. The forge heated unevenly. The left side was 100 degrees hotter than the right. He determined this by the color of the coal. Back in Portland, he'd had a pyrometer. Here, he had to rely on his eyes and experience. His experience told him that the left side was overheating, while the right side wasn't heating up enough. Any blade forged on this forge would have a difference in structure from the tang to the tip. Not critical for ordinary work, but it was enough to explain why the House of Castle made mediocre swords. He found a stockpile of steel, several bars of varying quality. None were marked. He knew neither the grade, nor the composition, nor the carbon content. In his world, he could have sent a sample to a lab. Here, he had to figure it all out himself, by the fracture, by the spark, by the sound. He picked up 1 bar and struck it against the anvil. The sound was dull, soft steel, low carbon, good for horseshoes and nails. The second bar, a clearer ring, medium carbon, utility steel, good for making knives and tools. The third, a high-pitched ring, good steel, high carbon. You can forge blades from this, but you have to forge carefully. Steel like this doesn't forgive mistakes. That cracked sword was made from exactly this kind of steel. He spent his first day sorting the steel. He sorted the billets by quality. He labeled each one with a piece of charcoal on the rack. soft, medium, hard. Two apprentices peeked through the door and looked at him as if he were crazy. One asked what he was doing. Colin replied that he was tidying up. The apprentice snorted and walked away. On the second day, Colin repaired the bellows. He replaced the leather on the left one with a piece of bullhide he'd found in the storeroom. He adjusted the airflow. He checked the brazier. Now it heated evenly. The difference was noticeable right away. The coals glowed uniformly across the entire surface. Even heat. Master Harold stopped by in the evening. He looked at the forge. He looked at the rack with the labeled blanks. He didn't say anything. He left. Colin didn't know if that was a good sign or a bad one. On the third day, something happened that changed everything. In the corner of the forge stood a box of rejects, pieces of metal sent to be remelted, warped blanks, failed forgings, scraps. Colin was rummaging through the box out of sheer boredom when he found a piece of something strange, silvery, light, too light for its size, with a faint iridescent sheen on a chip. He took it in his hand, and the world fell silent. Not literally. The sounds remained. Hammers behind the wall, wind in the chimney, the creak of a door. But all of that receded, and something else came to the forefront. Something inside the metal. Colin stood motionless. A piece of silvery metal lay in his palm, and he felt it. He didn't hear, he didn't see, he felt. The metal was unhappy. It was a crazy word for a piece of ore, but he couldn't think of another. This piece was part of something bigger. It had been torn from the vein carelessly. Then they tried to forge it, but didn't know how. Then they tossed it into a trash bin, and it lay there, remembering that it had once been whole. Colin clenched his fingers. The sensation intensified. He sensed its structure. He didn't see it. He actually felt it. The metal grains were fine and dense. Not a single crack, not a single inclusion. A purity he'd never encountered in earth steel. This piece was perfect. And it had been thrown in the trash because they didn't understand what to do with it. He unclenched his fingers. The world returned. Sounds grew loud. He stood in the forge, holding a piece of unknown metal in his hand, and his hands were trembling. Not from fear, from realization. He had just sensed the metal from within, like an X-ray, but deeper, as if he'd stuck his head inside the crystal lattice and looked around. He placed the piece on the workbench. He picked up an ordinary steel bar. He squeezed it. Nothing, just ordinary cold metal. He picked up the silvery piece again. Silence. Depth. Structure. A sensation. He tried it 10 times. The result was the same. Nothing happened with the ordinary steel. With the silvery piece, the world seemed to sink deeper each time. By evening, he had realized 2 things. First, the silvery metal was mithril. He'd heard that word from the apprentices. Mithril, rare, expensive, light. No one at House Castle knows how to work with it, so they toss it into the smelter and sell it to wealthier houses. Second, he could sense the metal. Not all of it, not always, but he could. It was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. In Portland, he'd determined the condition of a blade by its color, sound, and smell. Here, he sensed it directly, as if the metal were speaking to him, not with words, with sensations. On the 4th day, he was ready. In the morning, he approached Master Harold. Harold was sitting at the table, sharpening a chisel. Colin said he wanted to try repairing that sword. Harold looked up. He stared at him for a long time. Then he smiled. He stood up and brought the shards. He tossed them onto the workbench in front of Colin, and said that first, He had to explain why the sword had cracked. If he got it right, he'd stay for another week. If he got it wrong, he'd leave today. Colin picked up a shard. He ran his finger along the fracture. And there it happened again. Quieter than with the mithril, weaker, but he felt it. He didn't just see the grain. He felt the tension inside the steel, traces of improper forging. The spot where the metal had screamed in pain even before it hit the water. He looked at Harold and began to speak. The carbon is distributed unevenly. The forging was too fast. The metal didn't have time to reorganize itself. It was quenched in cold water, but it needed warm oil. Steel of this type cracks from sudden temperature changes, and right here, on the edge, there was a micro crack left over from the forging. The failure started from there. Harold was silent for a long time. A minute. 2. Then, without a word, he placed a hammer in front of him. A heavy one, with an ash handle polished by thousands of hands. He said one word. Fix it. If you can mend it, you can stay. Colin worked for 6 hours, without a break, without food, without water. He didn't notice anything around him. The world had narrowed down to 2 pieces of steel on the anvil and the fire in the forge. First, he heated the pieces, slowly. Not the way the former owner of this body had done it, not the way they did it at the House of Castle. He raised the temperature gradually, degree by degree. He watched the color of the steel, dark red, cherry red, light cherry red. He stopped at light cherry red. In Portland, that would be about 800 degrees. Here, he relied solely on color. That was enough. He placed the first fragment on the anvil and touched it with his tongs. The resonance echoed back, quieter than with mithril, but enough. He sensed where the metal was fatigued, where the crystals had stretched and warped from improper forging, where internal stress had built up like water behind a dam. This sword had been aching long before it cracked. The crack in the quenching bath was not the cause, but the consequence. Like a heart attack in a man who had eaten fatty foods and been sedentary for 20 years, the heart had simply grown weary. Colin began the forging. Not roughly, not with brute force. He struck lightly, often, precisely. Each blow to a specific spot, each blow with a specific force. He wasn't shaping the metal, he was healing it. He was aligning its internal structure, breaking down the large grains, allowing the steel to reorganize itself. In his former life, this was called normalization. Heat it above the critical point, let it cool in the air, repeat. The structure evens out, the stress dissipates, the metal becomes homogeneous. Here, he did the same thing, but with one difference. He sensed when it was enough. Not by the textbook, not by the chart, by feel. The metal stopped screaming and began to hum. Even, calm, like a cat. After 2 hours, both fragments had been normalized. Now he had to join them together. Forging welding, one of the most difficult operations in hand forging. In Portland, he'd done this dozens of times. Here, the conditions were worse. No flux, no controlled atmosphere. Just charcoal and borax he'd found in the pantry. He sprinkled borax on the ends of the fragments. He heated them to welding temperature, a white-hot glow, almost blinding. The steel flowed like oil. He aligned the ends and struck. The first blow, the second, the third. Quickly, rhythmically, without letting the temperature drop. Sparks flew in all directions. The borax hissed and bubbled. The metal resisted. The 2 pieces refused to become one. Colin stopped. He closed his eyes. He placed his hand on the workpiece through a rag. And he asked, not with words, but with a feeling, what was wrong? The answer came instantly. The ends were contaminated. An oxide film, thin, invisible to the eye, but enough to interfere with the weld. He cleaned the ends again, removed a thin layer of metal from each. He doubled the amount of flux. He heated it again. This time, he waited before striking. He let the flux melt completely and drive out the oxides. Then he struck. The metal fused together. He felt it. He didn't see it. He felt it. The two pieces of steel became one. The seam disappeared, not on the outside, but from the inside. The crystal lattice had passed through the former fracture line as if it had never been there. For the next 4 hours, he worked on the shape. He straightened the blade and removed the curvature. He corrected the tang that the previous blacksmith had made crooked. He forged the edge. And all the while, he listened. The metal told him where to strike harder and where to strike more gently, where it wanted to be thin and where it wanted to be thick, where it needed flexibility and where it needed rigidity. Colin didn't argue. He followed the voice of the steel just as a violinist follows a melody. He did the tempering differently. No cold water. He heated the oil to 60 degrees, roughly, by feel. The oil was warm but not hot. He brought the blade to the right temperature. He checked it with a magnet. In Portland, he'd determined the tempering temperature using a magnet. Above the Curie point, steel loses its magnetic properties. Here, he didn't have a magnet. But in the pantry, he found a piece of magnetite in the pantry. It worked just as well. Colin held the red-hot blade up to the stone. It wasn't magnetic. That meant the temperature was above the Curie point. He lowered the blade into the warm oil, slower than in water, gentler. The steel sizzled but didn't scream. It didn't crack. He held the blade in the oil and counted. 40 seconds. He took it out. The metal had darkened. It had cooled to a temperature at which the temper colors were still visible. Now for tempering. He placed the blade in the forge on the cooling coals. He let it warm up evenly. 300 degrees, roughly. The tempering color was blue. Tempering to a blue color imparts elasticity and toughness. The blade won't be brittle. It won't break from an impact. It will spring back. An hour later, everything was ready. He took the blade out of the forge, placed it on the anvil, and tapped it with tongs. The sound, clear, high-pitched, long. The blade sang, not like it did before it broke. Better, clearer. Because Colin hadn't just repaired a crack. He'd fixed all the problems that had accumulated in this piece of steel since its birth in the forge. He'd evened out the structure, relieved the stress, applied the proper hardening and tempering. The sword was sound for the first time in its life. Harold stood in the doorway. Colin didn't know how long he'd been standing there. He held out the blade to the master, hilt first. Harold took it. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the blade in the light of the forge. He ran his finger along the edge. He tapped it with his fingernail. He heard the sound. His expression changed, not immediately, slowly. The anger faded. The suspicion faded. What remained was something Colin didn't immediately recognize. Surprise. The pure, sincere surprise of a grown man who had been making swords for 20 years and was seeing something he didn't understand for the first time. Harold looked at Colin, then back at the sword, then at Colin. He asked, "How?" Just one word. Colin shrugged. He said he'd simply listened to what the metal wanted and done as it asked. Harold was silent for a long time. Then he nodded and said he was staying. For the next 3 days, Colin lived like a ghost. He worked in the forge from dawn till dusk. He ate whatever was brought to him. He slept on a bench against the wall. No one spoke to him except Master Harold, and even then only briefly. The apprentices gave him a wide berth. 8 men, all older than his new body, all with calloused hands and heavy gazes. They'd seen him repair the sword. They'd heard that Harold had kept him on. and they weren't pleased about it. The guy who, a week ago, couldn't properly temper a training blade had suddenly done what none of them could. It seemed wrong, suspicious. The senior apprentice, Derek, was the worst of them all. 23 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands scorched down to his elbows. 5th year in the forge, next in line for the title of master. He didn't say anything directly to Colin, but Colin kept finding his tools out of place. His coal supply had been mixed with trash. Someone had mixed sand into his boron. Petty pranks, childish nonsense. Colin didn't react. He was a 27-year-old man in a teenager's body. He had no time for schoolyard bullying. He had work to do. The first task was to understand the scale of the problem. The castle house was small, the youngest of the 7 great smithing houses. Colin figured this out in his first few days from snippets of conversation and what hung on the walls. Certificates from the Imperial Chamber of Crafts. All of them were old. The most recent one was 12 years old. The house produced weapons of rank C and below, sometimes rank B. The last rank A weapon had been forged during the time of the current head's grandfather. There was only 1 forge, 8 apprentices, 1 master. Income was meager. The roof was leaking, literally. When it rained, water dripped onto the forge, and it wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Water on red-hot coals means steam and flying sparks. The second issue was the people. The head of the castle house bore the surname Castle. Bren Castle. Old. Sick. He rarely left the house. Master Harold ran the show. He was the head blacksmith, manager, and treasurer all rolled into one. Bren had 2 children, a son, Tyrus, 24 years old, and a daughter. Colin found out about the son quickly. Tyrus showed up at the forge on the 5th day after the sword had been repaired. Tall, well-groomed, soft hands. Not a blacksmith, a manager. He walked in, looked at Colin, and said nothing. But Colin read his gaze with ease. Tyrus was counting money. And the appearance of a talented blacksmith in a dying workshop was no joy to him, but a threat. If Colin revived the workshop, it would cease to be what Tyrus wanted it to be, a quiet, half-dead business that could be shut down so the building in the heart of the artisans' quarter could be sold. Colin realized this in 10 seconds. He'd seen people like that, people in Portland. Heirs who needed their father's workshop only as a plot of land for development. He learned about Brenna's daughter in a different way. On the 8th day after repairing the sword, in the evening, as Colin was putting away his tools, the blacksmith's door swung open. A girl walked in. Short, lean. Her short hair was pulled back. Her face bore a fresh scrape from her temple to her cheekbone. Her left hand was bandaged with a dirty bandage. A sword in its sheath hung behind her back. She walked past Colin without looking at him. She approached the forge. She crouched down next to it. She stretched her hands toward the heat. Colin noticed burns on her fingers. Old ones, layered, like a blacksmith's. But their placement was wrong. Not from a hammer or tongs, from the sword's hilt. She'd gripped the hilt so tightly and so often that the skin had been burned away by friction. He looked at the scabbard. The sword sat unevenly inside it. The hilt was too long for her hand. The balance was shifted forward. He could tell by the way the scabbard was pulling on the belt across her back, heavy and uncomfortable. She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were gray, tired, angry. She asked who he was. Colin replied that he was an apprentice. She said she knew all the apprentices, and he wasn't among them. Colin said he was new, or rather old, but different now. She frowned. He realized his explanation had come out strange. She said her name was May Castle, the daughter of the househead. She'd been on a hunt for 3 weeks and had just returned. Colin nodded. She looked at his hands, smooth, No calluses, no burns. She snorted. She said his hands were too delicate for an apprentice. Colin wasn't offended. She was right. This body needed time to toughen up. May pulled the sword from its sheath. She placed it on the workbench. Colin looked at it, and it almost physically pained him. The sword was old, very old. The steel had darkened from countless cleanings. The edge was chipped in 3 places. The hilt was wrapped in layer upon layer of leather. The balance was terrible. The center of gravity lay farther from the guard than it should have, for a right-hander. But May was left-handed. He could tell by the way she pulled the sword out with her left hand, by the calluses on her left palm, by the way she turned the blade. This sword was made for a large right-hander, but it was carried by a short left-hander with an injured wrist. He'd seen how she moved her left wrist, carefully, with limitations. An old injury, maybe a fracture, maybe a dislocation that hadn't healed properly. Her hand worked, but not through its full range of motion. And with that limited wrist, she held a sword that was heavier and longer than it should have been. Every day. He asked whose sword it was. She said it was her grandfather's. Her voice changed. It grew quieter. She said her grandfather had been the last true blacksmith in their house. He'd forged this blade himself. Rank D, not very high. But her grandfather had put his heart and soul into it. She'd been carrying it since she was 15. Colin looked at the sword again. Rank D. He was already beginning to understand the local ranking system. D means a functional weapon. No special properties, sturdy but ordinary. For a hunter who goes after monsters, it's like going after a bear with a pocket knife. He asked why she didn't get something better. May looked at him in a way that made him realize the question was wrong. She said this sword was like family to her. And she left. Colin was left alone. He looked at the workbench where his grandfather's blade had lain just a minute ago and thought. Every day, this girl risked her life with a weapon that could kill her. Not because the enemy was stronger, because the sword wasn't right for her. But she carried it out of loyalty to a dead man. He realized what he had to do. But not now. First, he had to prove that he could forge, not just repair. A month had passed. Colin counted the days by the notches on the beam above his workbench. 31 notches. 31 days in a foreign world, in a foreign body. Over the course of that month, his body had begun to change. Calluses had appeared on his palms. The first burns on his forearms. His shoulders had broadened. Not by much, but he could feel the difference. His arms had grown stronger. He could hold the hammer for hours without his hands shaking by evening. His body was getting used to the work that its former owner had avoided. Over the past month, he had made 4 knives and 2 short swords, all C rank. Master Harold inspected each one. He rejected the first knife, saying the edge was uneven. Colin looked at it and agreed. He was still getting used to the local steel. It behaved differently from earth steel. It reacted slightly differently to forging. It cooled faster. It took longer to heat up, as if it were resisting, or sizing him up. Harold accepted the second blade in silence. He turned the third one over in his hands and said it wasn't bad. For Harold, that was like a standing ovation. He inspected the swords more thoroughly. He bent them, he tapped them, he slashed at the test stands in the courtyard with them. Both held up. Grade C, sturdy, reliable, without character, but without weaknesses. Workhorses. Harold sold them to the merchant for a sum that made him raise his eyebrows. Usually, swords from the House of Castle went for next to nothing. This merchant valued them at twice the standard price. Not because the rank was higher, the rank was the same, but the quality of the steel was different. The balance was different. The merchant wasn't a fool. He could feel the difference. Over the past month, Colin had been repairing things. A lot of them. Every evening, someone would bring in something broken. A knife with a cracked tang, an axe with a loose blade, a sickle whose cutting edge had been worn down to the point of uselessness. Menial work. Peasant work. The apprentices considered it beneath them. Colin took everything. He repaired things quickly and neatly. For a copper coin. For 2. Sometimes for bread. People came more and more often. By the second week, there was a line of 5 people at the smithy door in the evening. By the third, 8. Harold watched this in silence. Colin didn't know what Harold was thinking, but the line kept growing. Over the course of that month, he had studied resonance, not completely. The ability was like a muscle he had only just begun to train. He could sense the structure of any metal if he touched it long enough. With ordinary steel, it took about a minute. With mithril, it was instantaneous. It barely worked with bronze and copper, just a faint hum. Iron and steel gave the clearest response. He experimented every day, taking different pieces from the scrap box, holding them. He listened. He recorded his sensations, not on paper, but in his head. Soft steel sounded muffled and warm, like a cello. Hard steel rang high and dry, like a bell. Mithril sang. There was no other word for it. A pure tone without overtones, like a tuning fork. He discovered something else as well. When he forged with resonance, the result was always better. Not by an order of magnitude, but noticeably so. The blade was slightly smoother, the edge was slightly sharper, the balance was slightly more precise. As if he and the metal were working together rather than against each other. And he began to prepare for the main task, the sword for May. She returned every 3 or 4 days. She'd go out hunting. She'd come back with new bruises and scrapes. Every time, she'd stop by the forge. She'd warm her hands by the furnace. Sometimes she'd sit in silence. Sometimes she'd talk. Colin listened. He learned a lot. She hunted alone, without a partner, without a team. Because the House of Castle couldn't afford to hire a hunting party, and she didn't want to go under someone else's name. She killed E and D rank beasts, sometimes C rank. Once she came back with a torn shoulder and said she'd encountered a C rank and barely escaped. Colin looked at her sword that evening and saw a new notch on the blade, a deep one. The steel hadn't withstood the blow. To fight a C rank monster, she needed at least a B rank weapon. She had a D rank one. He began to make plans. First, the steel. Ordinary steel wouldn't do. He needed the best steel he could find in the house's stockpiles. He went through the entire shelf. He found 3 bars of good quality, high carbon, pure, but not enough. For a B rank weapon, he'd need something else. He remembered the mithril. That piece from the box of rejects. Small, about the size of a fist. But if he fuses it into the core of a steel blade like a vein, like rebar, a thread of mithril inside a steel body, it will combine the strength of ordinary steel with the lightness of mithril. He'd never tried anything like this before. Not in this world, nor in the previous one. But resonance told him it would work. Mithril wanted to be light. Steel wanted to be strong. Together, they complemented each other. Like 2 people who are ordinary on their own, but stronger together. Then there was balance. May is left-handed. Her wrist has limited mobility. She needs a short blade, lighter than standard, with the center of gravity closer to the hilt, so her wrist doesn't get tired. And so every strike comes from the shoulder and elbow, rather than the wrist. The hilt is shorter than usual, designed for a small hand, with a curve that fits her left hand, just as standard swords fit a right hand. He thought through every detail. In the evenings, when May came to warm herself by the forge, he watched her, how she moved, how she held her cup, how she turned her wrist, how she sat down, how she stood up. He memorized her body not as a man memorizes a woman, but as a tailor memorizes a client. Every angle, every limitation, every habit. He forged this sword in his mind for 2 weeks before he even touched the hammer. And one question remained. Her grandfather's blade. May wouldn't part with it willingly. To her, it wasn't a weapon, but a memory. To throw it away would be to betray her grandfather. Colin thought about it for 3 days, and then he found a solution. He wouldn't throw away the old blade. He would remelt it. He would take the steel from her grandfather's sword and weave it into the core of the new one, right next to the mithril thread. The spirit of the old blade would remain inside the new one. Her grandfather would be with her. But the weapon would finally be hers. He told Harold, not everything. Not about the resonance, just about the idea. Mithril in the core. Her grandfather's reforged blade as part of the new one, balanced for a left-hander. Harold listened in silence. Then he asked how he knew May was left-handed. Colin said she had calluses on her left hand and always picked things up with her left. Harold looked at him strangely. He said May had been left-handed since birth, but all the swords at House Castle were forged for right-handed use. It had always been that way. Tradition demanded it. Colin asked why they needed a tradition that crippled its owner. Harold didn't answer. But that evening, Colin found the key to the storeroom containing the finest materials on his workbench. Harold didn't say a word. He just left the key there. Colin began forging a sword for May on the 35th day. He arrived at the smithy before dawn. He stoked the forge. He laid out everything he had prepared on the workbench. 3 bars of the finest steel from the storeroom, a piece of mithril the size of a fist, and May's grandfather's sword. She didn't know. Colin had asked Harold to take the blade for the night under the pretext of inspecting it. May handed it over without question. She trusted Harold like a father. Colin took his grandfather's blade in his hands and activated resonance. The old steel spoke immediately, loudly, sadly. This blade was worn out. Decades of service, hundreds of sharpenings, thousands of strikes. The edge worn down to the limit. The blade's body riddled with micro cracks. It held together through sheer stubbornness, not strength. 2 or 3 more serious battles, and it would have snapped in May's hand. In a fight against a monster. Colin clenched his teeth. It was like hunting with a time bomb. But deep within the worn-out steel, he heard something else. A voice. Not literally, an imprint. May's grandfather had forged this blade with love, not with skill. He had little skill. A D rank was honest but modest work. But there was so much love that the metal still remembered it decades later. Warmth. Care. This blade wasn't made for war. It was made for a granddaughter who hadn't been born yet. Grandpa forged it for the long haul, for the future. Colin felt a lump in his throat. He laid the blade on the anvil and began. The first stage, dismantling his grandfather's sword. He removed the hilt, took off the guard. All that remained was the bare blade, darkened, worn, tired. Colin heated it slowly, brought it to forging temperature, and began to hammer it. Not for shape, for purification. He was hammering out the slag and oxides that had accumulated over the years. He folded it. He hammered it. He folded it again. Just as they do when making Damascus steel. Only here he wasn't creating a pattern. He was purifying the metal. Freeing it from fatigue, leaving only pure steel and that imprint of love his grandfather had infused into it while forging it. The resonance helped. He could sense where the slag was and where the pure metal was, where he could strike harder and where he needed to be gentler. After 2 hours, he had a piece of steel the size of a finger. Small, pure, ringing. All that remained of his grandfather's blade after the purification. But this finger of steel sounded warm and clear. The memory remained. Stage 2. Mithril. This was more difficult. Mithril didn't behave like ordinary metal. It didn't want to heat up. It didn't want to melt. It didn't want to take shape. Colin placed a piece in the forge and waited. The coals burned with a white heat, but the mural barely turned pink. He tried blowing harder. The bellows were working at their limit. The mural turned red, but no more than that. Colin stopped. He sat down on the floor. He thought. In Portland, he'd worked with titanium. Titanium is capricious too. It doesn't like oxygen. It doesn't like nitrogen. It melts at high temperatures. It requires a protective atmosphere. But titanium isn't alive. And mithril, as he sensed through resonance, was alive. It didn't resist the heat. It was waiting to be asked. Colin approached the furnace. He placed his hand next to the mithril. He closed his eyes, and he asked. Not with words, with a sensation. He showed the mithril what he wanted to make. A thin thread, flexible yet strong, the core of a blade, a conduit through which power would flow. The mithril responded. It softened, not because of the heat. The temperature hadn't changed. It had simply agreed. Colin pulled it out of the forge and began to draw it out with blacksmith's tongs. Slowly, carefully. The mithril stretched like taffy, obediently, joyfully. It liked being thin. It wanted to be light. An hour later, Colin had a strand of mithril as long as an elbow and as thick as a quill. Silvery, flexible. It shimmered in the light of the forge like morning dew. Stage 3. Assembly. He took 3 steel bars and began shaping the main blade. He forged slowly, by the book. Normalization after each series of strikes. Even heating, controlled cooling. The resonance worked continuously. He could hear every grain of steel, every tension, every moment when he needed to stop and let the metal rest. He shaped it according to the design he'd conceived over 2 weeks of observation. A short blade, 30 inches, a third lighter than standard. The blade is slightly curved, not like a katana, less so, a barely noticeable curve that aids in chopping strikes from the shoulder. The guard is simple, small. It doesn't interfere with a parry. The hilt was designed for a small left hand with limited wrist mobility. Once the blank had taken shape, he made an incision along the spine of the blade, a thin groove running from the hilt to the tip. He placed a thread of mithril there. Next to it was that very finger of steel from his grandfather's sword. He heated it all together and fused it. The mithril accepted the steel accepted the mithril. His grandfather's metal lay between them like a bridge. The resonance sang. 3 voices merged into one. The steel spoke of strength. The mithril sang of lightness. My grandfather's metal whispered of love. He tempered it in oil, warm oil, just like last time. But this time he added something new. He kept his hand on the blade through the cloth while it cooled in the oil and listened. The moment of martensitic transformation. Austenite turns into martensite. The crystals rearrange themselves. The steel becomes hard. In Portland, that's physics. Here, it was sound. High-pitched, like a string. Mithril amplified it. The old-fashioned steel softened it. The result was perfect. Tempering. 2 hours at a low temperature. The color of the temper lines was golden, not blue like on the training sword. Golden. Harder. But the mithril thread compensated for the brittleness. The blade could be both hard and tough at the same time. Mithril provided what ordinary steel cannot. Sharpening. 3 hours on the whetstone, even, razor sharp. The edge glistened. He wrapped the hilt in leather he found in the storeroom, soft, thin. A separate coil for each finger with varying tension. His left hand would rest on it and not want to let go. He finished at dawn the next day. 20 hours of work with just one break for water. He laid the blade on the workbench and looked at it. Short, light, with a barely noticeable silvery sheen along the spine where the mithril thread ran beneath the steel. He touched the blade with his finger. The resonance echoed powerfully and clearly. This sword was sound. This sword was whole. This sword knew for whom it was made. He gave himself a day to rest. He slept until noon. He ate for the first time in a day. He drank 3 mugs of water. His body ached. His hands trembled. 20 hours of forging in an 18-year-old body that had only begun working in earnest a month ago. His muscles responded to every movement with a burning pain. But his mind was clear. In the evening, he carried the sword out of the forge. May was sitting by the furnace as usual, warming her hands, this time without any fresh wounds. A rare day. Colin placed the blade on the workbench in front of her. He simply set it down. He said nothing. May looked at the sword, then at Colin, then back at the sword. She didn't understand right away. She asked what it was. Colin replied that it was her sword. She frowned. She said she already had a sword. Colin paused. Then he said that inside this blade was the steel from her grandfather's sword. May froze. Her hand, which had already been reaching for the blade, stopped mid-air. She looked at Colin, and there was something in her eyes that he didn't immediately understand. Fear, anger, hope, all at once. She asked what he had done with her grandfather's sword. Colin explained. Her grandfather's blade was on the brink. 2 or 3 more battles and it would have broken, but the steel inside it was alive. Colin purified it. He removed the dross and fatigue. He left only pure metal and the warmth his grandfather had infused into it while forging it. And he wove that steel into the core of the new blade. His grandfather was inside, with her. But the weapon now suited her, to her hand, to her body, to her fighting style. May was silent for a long time. Colin counted the beats of his heart. 12, 20, 30. She took the sword, with her left hand. Her fingers wrapped around the hilt, and Colin saw her face change, not abruptly, slowly, like a sunrise. The hilt fit into her palm as if it had grown from it. Every finger found its place. Every coil of leather settled precisely under the right joint. Her wrist didn't tense up. It didn't twist. It didn't ache. Her hand simply held the sword, easily, like holding a spoon or a paintbrush, like holding something that belongs to you. May raised the blade. It was a third lighter than her grandfather's. The balance was closer to her hand. The blade didn't pull forward and downward. It stood level, obediently, waiting. She made 3 movements, a horizontal chop, a vertical strike, a thrust. Slowly, testing it out. The blade sliced through the air without a sound. Light, precise, fast. On the horizontal strike, she usually compensated for the heavy balance with her wrist. Colin had seen this for weeks. Her wrist would twitch. It would ache. It would slow her swing. Now, her wrist didn't move. She didn't need to. The sword went where she wanted it to go, without any adjustments, without a struggle. May froze after the 3rd movement, the blade in her outstretched arm, the tip pointing forward. She stood motionless. 3 seconds. 5. 10. Then she said one word, quietly, almost a whisper. She said he had been waiting for her. Colin nodded. He knew she wasn't talking about the sword. She was talking about her grandfather, about the steel that remembered the warmth of old hands, about how her grandfather had finally stopped pulling her down and had started holding her up. May sat down on a bench. She placed the sword on her lap. She ran her finger along the spine of the blade. Where the silvery mithril sheen glint ran as a thin line. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. She was holding them back, just as she held back everything else. The pain in her hand, the exhaustion from the hunt, fear for the home that was crumbling around her. She held it all inside because she was the eldest, because someone had to. Colin turned away. He walked over to the forge. He tossed some coals onto the fire. He set the kettle on. When the water boiled, he poured 2 mugs and placed one next to her. May took the mug. She took a sip. They sat in silence. She sat with the sword on her lap. He stood by the forge, mug in hand. The silence in the smithy was warm, not oppressive. Half an hour later, May stood up. She sheathed the sword. Her old scabbard was too wide for the new blade. It dangled loosely inside. Colin said he'd make her a new scabbard. May nodded. She looked at him. She said thank you. For the first time in a month, she said something to him other than grunts and short questions. Then she left. Colin finished his tea. That morning, Harold stopped by the blacksmith's shop. He seemed strange, quiet and pensive. He said that May had gone hunting with her new sword. Colin nodded. Harold paused. Then he said that May had stopped by his place last night and shown him the blade. He examined it, tested it, tapped it, listened to it, and said one word that Colin hadn't expected. Grade B+. Not B, B+. On the verge of an A. For a second-month apprentice, that's impossible. For any blacksmith at the House of Castle, that's impossible. The last rank A blade was forged by May's grandfather 30 years ago. Harold looked at Colin and asked the question that had hung between them since day one. He asked who he was. Colin remained silent. He couldn't tell the truth, not now. Maybe never. Harold waited. Then he nodded. He said it was fine. He said the answer could wait. For now, they had work to do. The roof was leaking. There were no orders. Their reputation was in the gutter. The House of Castle was dying, and a single B-rank blade wouldn't change that. They needed more. Colin agreed. 3 days later, May returned from the hunt, without a single scratch. For the first time in all the time Colin had known her, she walked into the forge. She laid the sword on the workbench. The blade was covered in the monster's blood, dark and thick, but without a single nick, without a single scratch. May looked at Colin and smiled, for the first time. The smile was brief, slightly crooked, as if her facial muscles had forgotten how to do it. But it was genuine. She said she'd killed an S-rank beast with a single blow. The sword cut through the armor as if it were butter. She'd never fought like that before. She'd never felt a weapon as an extension of her arm. Her whole life, she'd fought with a sword against monsters. But now, she'd fought only the monster. Colin took the blade, wiped the blood off it, checked the edge. Perfect. The mithril thread inside hummed softly. The metal was sated. He said the sword needed to be cleaned and sharpened. May said she'd do it herself. She sat down on a bench and took out a whetstone. Colin showed her the correct angle at the tip. She remembered it on the first try. While she was sharpening the sword and Colin was cleaning up the forge, Derek walked in, the senior apprentice. He looked at May with the new sword. He looked at Colin. His face turned to stone. He didn't say a word. He turned around and walked out. Colin watched him go. He knew this wasn't the end. Derek had been working toward the title of master for 5 years. For 5 years, he had been the best apprentice. And now some kid who, just a month ago, couldn't even harden a training sword, had forged a B+ grade blade. For Derek, this wasn't just upsetting. It was impossible. And the impossible is frightening. In the 6th week, a stranger came into the smithy. Colin was alone. Harold had gone to the market for coal. The apprentices were working in the courtyard. The door opened, and a girl walked in. Young, maybe 19, maybe 20. Tall, slim. Her skin was dark from the sun. Her black hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail. Her eyes were narrow. Her features weren't like those of the locals. Her cheekbones were higher. Her chin was sharper. Her clothes were travel clothes, worn and threadbare. It was clear she'd been walking for a long time. On her back was a long bundle wrapped in canvas. She stopped in the doorway and surveyed the smithy, slowly, intently, the way one surveys a place they might have to leave in a hurry. Then she looked at Colin. He was waiting. She said she was looking for a blacksmith who repairs things that can't be repaired. Colin raised an eyebrow. She untied the bundle and placed it on the workbench. A bow. But not the kind of bow Colin had seen with the local hunters. Those were simple, wooden, with a sinew string. This one was different. A composite bow. The body was made of bone and wood glued together. The limbs were made of something shiny, not metal, not bone, something in between. A horn composite. Colin had seen ones like this in museums. Mongolian bows, Turkish bows, Korean bows. Composite bows that shot farther and with greater power than wooden ones, despite being smaller. Only this one was broken. The upper limb was cracked. The crack ran from the middle to the tip. The bowstring had been removed. The bow was unusable. Colin touched the limb. The resonance sounded strange, not like metal. Quieter. Deeper. The material of the limb wasn't just bone and horn. It contained thin threads of metal, woven into the structure, like the mithril vein in May's sword. Only here, the threads were made of something Colin didn't recognize. Light, yet durable, with a warm sound. He looked at the girl and asked what kind of metal it was. She was silent, for a long time. Then she said she didn't know. The bow had belonged to her mother. Her mother was from the northern nomads. She'd made the bow herself, from materials that only nomads know where to find. It was the only thing she had left from her mother. Her voice was even, too even. Colin recognized that tone. That's how people speak who are used to hiding their pain. He asked her name. Soyon. Soyon Khan. Half-blood. Her mother was a nomad. Her father was from the southern cities. The Southerners considered her an outsider because of her nomadic blood. The nomads had cast her out for being mixed blood. She didn't belong to any people. Only this bow told her who she was. And it was breaking in her hands. Colin examined the crack more closely. The problem was serious. This wasn't metal. It was a composite, bone, horn, wood, and unknown metallic threads. Each material behaved differently. It expanded differently. It cracked differently. To repair it meant understanding how all these layers worked together, and how they had broken. He spent an hour studying it. He turned resonance up to full power. He listened to each layer. The bone was worn out from constant stress. The horn had begun to delaminate. The adhesive between the layers had dried out and lost its elasticity. The metallic threads were intact. They held everything together just as a skeleton holds a body. But the surrounding tissues were dying off. Colin realized that a simple repair wouldn't help. You can't just glue a crack in the bone and horn. They'll crack again in a week. The binding material needs to be replaced. The bone and horn need to be treated with something that will restore their elasticity. He thought about it for 2 days. He tried various oils and resins. Nothing worked. On the 3rd day, he remembered. In Portland, he had once restored a 17th century Japanese yumi bow, bamboo and wood, ancient glue made from fish bladders. He'd found the recipe in an old book back then. Fish glue, boiled down from sturgeon bladders. It's eternal, flexible, durable, and, most importantly, it's compatible with bone and horn because it's essentially bone itself, only in liquid form. He sent his junior apprentice to the fish market for the bladders. The boy returned with a sack of sturgeon bladders and wide eyes. Colin simmered the glue for 4 hours, slowly, in a double boiler, until it became a thick, transparent mass. It smelled awful. It worked perfectly. He took the bow apart, carefully, layer by layer, like a surgeon. He soaked the bone in warm oil to restore its moisture. He cleaned the horn. He glued the layers together with fish glue. He pulled it tight, left it to dry for 2 days. Then he turned his attention to the bowstring. The old bowstring was made of sinew. It was worn out, but in Soyeon's bag, Colin noticed something. A cloak. An old one. Worn. Made of some kind of thick woven fabric. She'd been carrying it around for years. She didn't wear it. She didn't throw it away. Colin asked whose cloak it was. Soyeon said it belonged to her mother, and her voice became too even again. Colin thought for a moment. Then he asked if he could take a single thread from the fabric, just one thread. That's all he needed. Soyeon looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. He carefully pulled a single thread from the edge of the cloak, a long one, a strong one, and he wove it into the new bowstring, a sinewy core. His mother's thread inside, like mithril in May's blade, invisible, but supportive. 5 days later, the bow was ready. Colin pulled the bowstring taut and carefully bent his shoulders. The bow responded with a sound he'd never heard before. Low, deep, like a double bass. His shoulders moved in unison. The crack had disappeared. The glue held. The metallic threads inside hummed evenly and contentedly. He called for Soyeon. She had been living all these days in the room above the smithy that Harold had set aside for her. She hadn't gone out. She had barely eaten. She had been waiting. She entered the smithy and saw the bow. Colin handed it to her. She took it. Her hands didn't tremble. Her expression didn't change. She raised the bow. She drew the string without an arrow, testing its strength and range. Her shoulders bent smoothly, softly, without a crack or a creak. Soyeon held the bow at full draw for 3 seconds. Then she released the string. The string sang, low, warm, and Soyeon closed her eyes. She stood like that for 10 seconds, with her eyes closed, with the bow in her hands. Then she opened her eyes, and Colin saw that they were wet. She didn't say anything. She nodded. She turned around. She walked out. The next day she didn't leave, nor the day after that. She came to the smithy in the morning with a mug of tea. She set it on the workbench next to Colin, silently. She sat down in the corner. She took out some arrows and began sharpening the tips. Colin didn't ask why she'd stayed. He already knew. Rumors spread faster than the wind. By the end of the 2nd month, the apprentice from the House of Castle was the talk of the city's 3 markets. Not loudly, not openly, in whispers. Hunters told other hunters that there was a young man in the castle's workshop who could hear. Arms dealers were passing the word among themselves that the castle's swords had changed, stronger, more precise, more expensive. May returned from another hunt and said that during a rest stop, 2 unfamiliar hunters had asked about the blacksmith who had forged her blade. They'd seen her fight. They'd seen how her short sword cut through the steel tail's armor. They wanted to know where to get one just like it. May sent them away, not out of anger, out of caution. She understood that drawing attention was dangerous. Colin understood that too, but there was no stopping the rumors, especially after what happened in the 3rd month. A red-haired guy came to the smithy early in the morning, young, maybe 17, skinny, long arms, long legs, awkward like a foal not yet used to its own body. His name was Aiden. He was the youngest apprentice at the House of Castle, the very youngest, the one everyone else sent to fetch coal and water. Colin had seen him before, just a glimpse. Aiden was always on the periphery, silent, quick, trying to become invisible. He walked into the blacksmith's shop and stood by the door for a long time. Colin waited. Finally, Aiden spoke. He said he wanted to learn, not from Harold, from Colin. He'd watched Colin work every evening through the crack in the door. He'd seen how he listened to the metal, how he touched the steel before striking it, how he closed his eyes and held his breath. He wanted to learn to do the same. Colin looked at him and saw himself. Not literally, but the feeling was similar. A skinny kid in a workshop where no one takes him seriously. Except Colin was 14 when he went to his first master in Portland. Aiden was 17. And this wasn't his first master, just the first one who might turn out to be the real deal. Colin agreed, but on one condition: theory first, then practice. He began teaching Aiden what no one here knew, not resonance. Resonance can't be taught. He taught him metallurgy, what carbon is and why it's in steel, why some steel is soft and other steel is hard, what happens during heating and cooling, why quenching in water is dangerous but in oil is safe, what tempering is and why it's needed. He drew with charcoal on the smithy wall. Crystal lattices, phase diagrams, simplified, rough, but they worked. Aiden listened with his mouth agape. He took notes in the notebook Colin had bought for him at the market. He asked questions, sometimes silly ones, sometimes surprisingly precise ones. A week later, he could already explain why a blade cracks if it's quenched incorrectly. After 2 weeks, he could determine the approximate composition of steel by the color of the spark on an emery wheel. After 3 weeks, he made a knife himself. A simple one, grade F, but done right, with proper hardening, with a smooth edge, with the right tempering. Harold looked at the knife. He looked at Aiden. He looked at Colin. He didn't say anything. But Colin noticed that evening, Harold was sitting at the table, studying the drawings on the wall. Crystal lattices, phase diagrams. He looked at them for a long time, like a man who had been doing something out of habit for 30 years and was seeing for the first time why it worked. In the 4th month, the first assassination attempt took place, at night. Colin was sleeping on a bench in the smithy. Soyan lived upstairs. May was out hunting. Aiden had gone home. Colin woke up to a sound, not a loud one, a quiet one, a rustle. Someone was in the smithy. He didn't move. He lay there with his eyes closed, listening. Footsteps. Soft ones. 2 people, maybe 3. They were moving toward his workbench. No, toward the shelf with the blanks. Colin realized. They hadn't come for him. They'd come for the metal, for the mithril. That piece he'd found in the reject bin had been sitting separately on the workbench for a long time. Everyone in the workshop knew about it. And apparently, someone outside the walls had found out too. He opened his eyes. Darkness. The forge had gone out. Only moonlight streaming in through the window. 2 silhouettes by the rack, a third at the door. Colin wasn't a fighter. He never had been, not in Portland, not here. But he was in the blacksmith shop. And in the blacksmith shop, there's a hammer, and tongs, and red-hot rods. Only the forge wasn't burning. The rods were cold. The hammer was heavy, and though his hands had grown stronger, they weren't built for a fight. He did the only thing he could. He screamed, loudly, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. The silence shattered. The silhouettes flinched. One of them dropped something. The clang of metal on the stone floor. A door slammed overhead, and Soyeon came tumbling down the stairs, a bow in her hands. An arrow knocked. She was shooting in the dark, guided by sound. The arrow struck the wall right next to the head of one of the thieves. He let out a shriek. All three lunged toward the door. The third one, who had been standing guard, tripped over the threshold and fell. Soyeon was there in a second. Colin didn't see what she did. He heard a dull thud and a groan. Then the light came on. Harold ran in with a lantern. Behind him were two apprentices. A man lay on the floor by the door. His face was covered with a cloth. He was dressed in black. A short knife hung from his belt. The other two had fled. Harold turned the man over. He pulled the cloth from his face. This wasn't a street thief. It was a servant. The clothes beneath the black cloak were fine. His hands were well manicured. He wore a signet ring on his finger. Harold looked at the signet ring, and his face froze. He recognized the symbol. House Ordo. The third of the 7 great houses, not the strongest, but the most cunning. They had sent men for the myrrh, or for secrets, or for both. Harold looked at Colin, then at Soyeon, who was holding a bow, then at the bound servant of House Ordo on the floor. He said that everything would change now. Colin nodded. He knew. The rumors had reached the great houses, and the great houses had come for him. The morning after the attack was difficult. Harold sent the prisoner to the city guard with a letter describing what had happened. He attached the seal of House Ordo as proof. The guard at the gate read the letter and turned pale. Accusing one of the 7 great houses of theft is no minor complaint. It's politics. Harold knew this. He wasn't expecting justice. He was biding his time. While the guards were figuring out what to do with the prisoner, House Ordo would be figuring out how to handle the scandal. And while everyone was thinking, House Castle could get to work. Colin understood the logic. Harold wasn't playing chess, he was playing tug-of-war. Every day of silence was another day Colin could forge. But the silence couldn't last forever. The day after the attack, Tyrus arrived, the son of the head of the house. He walked into the forge, his face as white as a sheet. Not from fear, from anger. He spoke with Harold behind closed doors. Colin could hear them through the wall. Not everything, just snippets. Tyrus said that Colin had drawn unnecessary attention, that House Ordo would not forgive the humiliation, that they needed to hand over the boy and the myrrh and forget about the whole affair. Harold replied something quietly. Colin couldn't make out the words, but Tyrus came out even angrier than when he went in. He slammed the door so hard that dust rained down from the ceiling. Colin went back to work. He had no time for politics. He had a spear to finish, a spear for Aiden. It was an idea that had come to him 2 weeks ago. Aiden was a quick learner, but it was still too early for him to forge at a level higher than F. On the other hand, he was nimble, long-armed, with good coordination. Colin watched how he moved, how he handled the tools, how he maneuvered around obstacles in the cramped smithy. The body of a fighter, not a blacksmith. He asked Aiden if he knew how to fight. Aiden hesitated. He said a little. His father had taught him how to use a stick when he was younger. Colin nodded. A stick meant a spear, a long weapon for long arms. He began forging the tip. The steel was average, not the best. You don't need mithril for your first weapon. You need honest work. He activated resonance and listened, but not to the metal, to Aiden. The boy was sitting in the corner, sharpening a knife blank. Colin watched his hands, the way they moved, quick, nervous, precise in small movements, but sweeping in large ones. Hands that want to reach far. Colin realized what shape the blade tip should be. long, narrow, like a willow leaf, with edges that allow for both stabbing and cutting. Lightweight, so the shaft wouldn't weigh it down and Aiden could wield it quickly. He forged it for 3 days. He took his time, every strike in the right place, every heating to the right color, quenching in oil, tempering until it turned yellow, harder than for a sword. A spearhead takes the blow on its point, not its flat surface. It needs hardness. Aiden found the shaft himself. Ash, straight, not free, 2 meters long. Colin approved. Good wood, light and strong. They assembled the spear together, the tip onto the shaft, wrapping at the base. A counterweight at the heel made from a bronze pommel. Colin let Aiden hold it. The boy took the spear and froze. Colin recognized that look on his face. May had had the same one, and so Jan too. That moment when an object fits perfectly in your hand and you realize it's yours. Aiden made a test thrust. Clumsy, no technique whatsoever, but the length of his arms and the spear lined up perfectly. The tip reached exactly where he wanted it to. Precisely, without any extra effort. He looked at Colin, and his eyes were ablaze. Colin said the spear was rank C, no higher, but it would be enough for a start. Aiden nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat was tight. Colin turned toward the horn and smiled. Rank C. His third blade for this particular person. It was the same every time. The moment of the handover. Silence. Eyes. Something clicks inside. No ranking system can measure that. 2 days after Aiden received the spear, a letter arrived at the forge. An official one, on letterhead, with the seal of the Imperial Chamber of Crafts. Harold opened it in front of Colin. He read it. His hands didn't tremble, but Colin saw his knuckles turn white. The Blacksmiths Tournament. Once every 2 years, the Empire holds a tournament among the 7 great houses. Each house fields 1 blacksmith. The blacksmith must forge a weapon in 3 days under the watchful eyes of the judges. The weapons are judged on rank and quality. The winner receives an imperial contract for 1 year. House Castle hadn't participated in the tournament for 8 years. The last time, they entered a blacksmith who came in last with a D-rank blade. After that, they stopped receiving invitations. Now an invitation had arrived again. Harold looked at Colin. Colin looked at the letter. The tournament was in 2 months, 6 months since his arrival in this world. He asked who would be representing the other houses. Harold replied that Kyron Vallenheim would most likely represent House Vallenheim, the best blacksmith on the continent, 28 years old, 12 years at the anvil, creator of 7 A-rank blades, a genius, a legend. Colin remained silent. A-rank, 7 of them, in 12 years. This Kyron was a true master, not some upstart with magical ability. The real deal. Someone who took talent and turned it into mastery through thousands of hours of work. Colin respected people like that. In Portland, he'd been just like that himself. 20 years of experience, thousands of hours at the workbench, dozens of blades restored. Only here, he was cheating. Resonance gave him an advantage that Kyron didn't have. Colin could hear metal. Kyron couldn't. It wasn't fair, and it bothered him. Harold asked if he'd go. Colin looked at the leaky roof, at the cracked walls, at the shelf of blanks, half of which were only good for nails. House Cassell was dying. The imperial contract meant money. Money meant a new roof, good steel, and a corner where he could sleep instead of on a bench. Money meant survival. He said yes. Harold nodded. Then he added something. He said that all 7 houses would be at the tournament, including House Ordo, the very same ones who'd sent thieves after the myrrh. At the tournament, They'd be watching Colin, studying him, trying to figure out his secret. And if he revealed too much, their attention would become more than just unpleasant. It would become dangerous. Colin understood. He had to participate. But he wasn't supposed to win. Or at least, he wasn't supposed to show everything he was capable of. A difficult task. To do enough to win the contract, but not so much that they'd come after him again. He began to prepare. Colin spent the 2 months leading up to the tournament in the forge. He only left to get food and coal. He slept 4 hours a night. The rest of the time, he forged. Not just one blade, 7. 7 blades for 7 people. May already had her own sword, but Colin wanted to improve it, to bring it up to full A rank. To do that, he needed to rebalance it and reinforce the mithril core. He asked May to leave the blade with him for 3 days. She looked at him suspiciously. Then, without a word, she placed the sword on the workbench and left. Trust. A month ago, she wouldn't have handed it over. Now she gave it to him without asking why. Colin worked on her blade like a surgeon on a patient. He removed the hilt. He heated the mithril core to working temperature. He listened through resonance. The core sounded steady, but could be louder. He hammered it in specific spots, not along its entire length, but only in 3 places where the vibration dampened prematurely upon impact. 3 strikes. Light, precise. The mithril responded gratefully. The vibration traveled from the tip to the heel of the blade without attenuation. A pure signal. Colin reassembled the sword. He rewound the hilt. He checked it. The sound had changed. It was higher, clearer, grade A, solid, confident. For Soyan, he made a set of arrowheads, 12 of them, each made of the same steel as her bow, each with a tiny point of mithril in the center. The resonance helped him understand what the metal in the bow's limbs wanted. It wanted continuity. It wanted the arrows to be part of the same instrument. Colin gave it that. The arrowheads rang in unison with the bow. When Soyan drew the bowstring with an arrow, the sound was one. A single, unified sound. The bow and arrow were like a voice and a word. For Aiden, he reforged the spearhead from rank C to B. After 2 months of training with May, Aiden had become a different person. His muscles had strengthened. His movements had become more precise. The spear, which had once been too large for him, now fit perfectly. But the spear head was outdated. Aiden had outgrown it. Colin made a new one. Longer, thinner, with 2 additional edges for a side cut. Tailored to Aiden's style, he liked to twist the shaft and cut in an arc rather than simply thrust. 4 blades remained, for people Colin didn't yet know. He couldn't forge for strangers. The resonance didn't work without a recipient. But he could prepare the blanks. 4 bars of the finest steel, normalized, cleaned, ready to take shape when the one for whom they were intended appeared. He placed them on a separate shelf and covered them with a cloth. He took a different one to the tournament, a single blade, a special one, made not for a specific person, but for an idea. It was a risk. The resonance was weaker without a specific recipient. But Colin wanted to test the theory. What if the recipient wasn't a person, but a principle? What if he forged a blade for the very concept of defense, not for a warrior, but for the sake of protection itself? He worked on this blade for 10 days, a longsword, straight, wide, with a deep groove down the center. Heavier than his usual work, created not for speed, but to stand between danger and the one you love. The resonance responded strangely. It didn't sing like it did when he forged for May. It didn't hum like it did when he worked on Soyan's bow. It was silent. But the silence wasn't empty. It was attentive, like the silence in a hall before the first note. Colin finished the blade the day before they left. He tested it. Grade A, but unusual. The blade didn't ring when struck against the anvil. It hummed. Low, deep, like a large bell. Harold looked at it and said he'd never seen anything like it. Colin said he didn't know what he'd created, but he felt it was right. They set out at dawn. Colin, Harold, May, Soyan, Aiden. 5 people from a dying house. A wagon with a broken wheel that Colin had repaired the day before. 2 horses that were older than Colin in both of his lifetimes combined. The journey to the capital took a week. For the first time, Colin saw the world beyond the city walls. Green hills, forests, villages where the blacksmith was the second in command after the village headman. They passed by one village, and Colin saw a blacksmith's shop, a small one, smoky. The blacksmith stood at the anvil, striking something red. The blows were uneven, hasty. The metal beneath the hammer warped and groaned. Colin could hear it even from the road, the quiet groan of steel being struck in the wrong place. He looked away. He couldn't stop at every smithy. The capital turned out to be enormous. Stone walls 10 men tall. The streets were wide and noisy. Weapons were everywhere. On the guards' belts, in shop windows, on tavern signs. A world that lives by steel. The tournament grounds were in the center of the city, an open space the size of 3 of House Cassell's forges. 7 bellows, 7 anvils, 7 workbenches, grandstands for spectators, a box for the judges. The banners of the 7 houses flew from the masts. The House of Cassell's banner was the smallest and most faded. Colin looked at it and thought that after the tournament, it would either be replaced with a new one or taken down for good. Registration took an hour. An official from the Chamber of Crafts looked at Colin and asked him his age again. 18. The official raised his eyebrows. The youngest participant was usually at least 25. Colin shrugged. He saw the other participants. 7 blacksmiths, 7 houses. He recognized Kyron Vallenheim immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, hands like those of a man who'd been wielding a hammer for 20 years. A calm face, confident, not arrogant, just calm. The calmness of a man who knows he's the best and doesn't need confirmation. Kyron looked at Colin. Their eyes met. Colin saw curiosity in his gaze, not hostility, interest. Like that of a master who sees a new tool and wants to understand how it works. Colin nodded. Kyron nodded back. The tournament was set to begin tomorrow, the first day of the tournament. Morning. 7 blacksmiths stood by 7 forges. The stands were full. The judges were in the box. Officials from the Chamber of Crafts stood with their notepads. The rules were simple. 3 days, 1 blade, any type of weapon, any metal from the provided stock. Judged on the quality of the steel, balance, sharpness, and overall rank. Colin examined the supply of metal on his workbench. A standard set. 3 types of steel of varying quality, a piece of bronze, and a small ingot of mithril, the same for everyone. He took the mithril in his hand. The resonance responded instantly. This mithril was purer than the one he'd found in the reject bin. Higher quality. A clearer sound. Colin put it back. He glanced around. 6 other blacksmiths were already stoking their forges. Kyron Vallenheim was working 3 workbenches away from him, calmly, methodically. His movements were flawless. Every gesture was economical, not a single superfluous movement. The hammer in his hands was like a pen in the hands of a calligrapher. Colin watched in awe. He recognized this level of skill. He'd seen it in Portland among the finest masters, people who had done the same thing thousands of times and perfected every movement. Kyron couldn't hear the metal, but he knew it by heart, just as a pianist knows the keys without looking. Colin stoked his forge. He began. He remembered Harold's words, "Don't show too much. Win the contract, but don't attract hunters. Grade A will be enough. Don't go any higher." He took the finest steel from the set and began forging. Slowly, carefully, without resonance. For the first few hours, he worked like an ordinary blacksmith, a good one, but ordinary, in sound and color. Drawing on 27 years of experience, that was enough. The steel obeyed. The shape took form under the hammer. He was making a dagger, short, wide, double-edged. A dagger isn't a primary weapon. It's a last resort, something you carry on your person and pull out when nothing else has worked. He was making it without a specific recipient in mind, like that longsword, for the idea, for the concept of a last chance. By the end of the first day, he had a blank, smooth, clean, without character. Grade B, maybe B+. The usual work of a good blacksmith. The judges walked among the workbenches and took notes. One stopped at Colin's station. He looked at the blank, jotted something down, moved on. Nothing special. By the end of the first day, Chiron had a blank for a longsword. Even at the blank stage, it was clear that it was a masterpiece. The lines were clean, the proportions were perfect. The metal sang under his hands, not like it did under Colin's, but differently, obediently, with discipline, like a choir under the direction of a strict conductor. Day 2. Colin worked faster. He was shaping the blade of a dagger, the fuller, the edges, the tang. It was delicate work. Precision, not strength, was needed here. His slender teenage hands came in handy. His fingers were long and flexible. They sensed every millimeter of the surface. By noon, he activated resonance. Quietly, not at full power. Just enough to hear where the steel wanted to be thinner and where it wanted to be thicker. The dagger began to change. Not abruptly, gradually. The lines became more alive, the curves more natural, as if the blade weren't being forged, but growing. The judge walked by again. He stopped. He looked longer. He took more notes. He moved on more slowly. By the evening of the second day, Colin had a dagger without a hilt and without tempering. An A- grade blank. Good work, but not outstanding. By evening, Chiron had a nearly finished blade. Even without tempering, it looked like a museum exhibit. The stands were buzzing. Everyone knew that Vallenheim would win, just as he had won the last 4 tournaments in a row. Day 3, the final day. Tempering and finishing. Colin got up before everyone else. He stoked the forge in the dark. He heated the dagger, slowly. He checked the temperature by its color. And here he allowed himself to do one thing he hadn't planned. He touched the red-hot blade through a rag and turned resonance up to full power. The world receded into the depths. The steel unfolded before him like a book. He saw every grain, every boundary, every direction. And he saw something else. Inside the mithril ingot he hadn't used yet. A voice. Quiet. Distant. Not metal. Someone's. Old. Very old. The voice said one word, which Colin didn't understand. But he felt it. The word meant something like, finally, or there you are, or welcome. He shuddered. He opened his eyes. The blade was in his hands. The horn was burning. The stands were still empty. Dawn was just breaking. He looked at the mithril ingot. Small, silvery, shimmering. Someone was waiting inside. Colin took the ingot, melted it, poured it in a thin stream into the hilt of the dagger. The mithril settled into the steel like a river into its bed, tempering. Oil. Warm. The exact temperature. The blade went in without a sound, no crack, no scream. Quiet, like a sigh. Aging. 2 hours, finishing touches, sharpening. An ash wood hilt wrapped in leather. A bronze guard. Simple. He finished by noon. He laid the dagger on the workbench. The resonance sang so loudly inside that Colin wondered why no one else could hear it. The dagger was an A rank, a solid, confident A. But there was something else inside, something the ranking system couldn't measure. That voice, that whisper, ancient, waiting. The judges announced the results by evening. Kyron Vallenheim, rank A+, first place, uncontested. His longsword was perfection. Colin Marsh, House Cassell, rank A, fourth place. Respectable, unexpected for a junior house, but not a sensation. The top 5 received contracts. House Cassell had made the cut. Colin exhaled. Harold beside him exhaled too. Behind the podium, May gripped the hilt of her sword and held her breath the entire time the results were being announced. Then she exhaled and sat down on a bench. Her legs wouldn't hold her up. They'd made it. House Cassell had received the imperial contract. Money, orders, survival. But the most important thing happened afterward. When the dagger was lying on the judging table and the judges had already stepped away, a young guard approached it, one of the imperial guard. He'd been standing guard by the stands. He looked at the dagger. He reached out and froze. His fingers were an inch from the hilt. He stood like that for 10 seconds, 20. Then he took it, and Colin heard the dagger click, not physically, inside. A resonance flared up and died down, like a lock that had found its key. The guard raised the dagger. He twirled it in his hand. His face changed. He looked at Colin across the entire hall. His eyes were wet. He didn't understand what had happened, but he felt it. The dagger had chosen him. For the first time in 200 years, a weapon had chosen its owner on its own. The stands were silent. The judges were silent. Kyron Vallenheim stood at his workbench, watching the guard with the dagger in his hand. His face was inscrutable, but Colin saw his eyes. In them was something he recognized. Hunger. The very same hunger Colin had felt when he first touched the meteorite anvil. The hunger of a master who has seen something he cannot and does not want to understand. After the tournament, life at House Castle changed. The imperial contract brought in money, not a huge amount, but enough. Colin made a list. First, the roof. The craftsmen arrived 3 days later. They took down the old roof. They laid a new one, heavy stone, sturdy. Not a single raindrop would get into the forge. Colin stood in the courtyard and watched as the last stone was put in place. May stood beside him. She said the roof had been leaking for 12 years. Colin said nothing. For 12 years, raindrops had fallen on the forge. For 12 years, the blacksmith had worked in damp conditions. For 12 years, the House of Castle had been slowly sinking. Second, steel. Colin bought the best ingots from a merchant who sold them by the sword. The merchant gave him a discount, not out of kindness, out of calculation. He had seen the quality of the castle's latest blades. He wanted the tradition to continue. Third, tools. New hammers, new tongs, a set of chisels, 3 sizes of files, whetstones made of northern granite. The forge was transformed. Fourth, people. This was more complicated. After the tournament, rumors ceased to be rumors and became facts. The dagger that chose its owner. an 18-year-old apprentice from the House of Castle. 4th place in the tournament, ahead of Vallenheim by a single criterion that cannot be measured by rank. People began to arrive. Hunters in need of weapons, merchants in need of goods, warriors in need of repairs, and a few others. A week after his return, a girl in a traveling cloak entered the forge. It was clean, too clean for the road. Her hands were soft. Her back was straight. She had the posture of someone who'd been taught to sit up straight since childhood. She introduced herself as Leon, the daughter of a fabric merchant from the capital. She said she was traveling through the province and wanted to see the famous blacksmith shop. Colin looked at her and immediately realized she was lying. Not about her name, about her occupation. The daughter of a fabric merchant doesn't hold her back like a guard officer. The daughter of a fabric merchant doesn't inspect a blacksmith shop as if she were writing a report. The daughter of a fabric merchant doesn't carry an imperial forged dagger under her raincoat. Colin noticed the hilt when Leanne bent down to examine the anvil. Imperial workmanship. Expensive. One of a kind. They make these for nobles and members of the royal family. He said nothing. He let her look. She walked around the smithy for an hour. She asked questions, lots of questions. Smart ones, precise ones. Not about blacksmithing, about people. Who works there? How long they've been there, where they get the ore, who they sell the weapons to. She was conducting an interrogation and didn't even try to hide it. She just disguised it as curiosity. Colin answered, partly the truth, partly evasively. She noticed every evasion and remembered it. He could see it in her eyes. She kept a journal, a small one, with a leather binding. She drew an anvil, a bellows, and tools in it. The drawings were good. Confident, the hand of an artist, or a cartographer, or a spy's. Leanne stayed in town. She rented a room at the tavern across the street. Every day she came to the blacksmith's shop. She'd sit in the corner. She'd draw. She'd ask questions. She'd drink tea with Soyan, who also sat in the corner. They hit it off quickly. 2 quiet girls who spoke little but precisely. 2 weeks later, Leanne told Colin that she knew who he was. Not in the sense of being transported from another world, but in the sense of talent. She said she'd seen the tournament. She'd been sitting in a box, not in the stands, in the judge's box. She saw how the dagger had chosen the guard. She saw Chiron's face. She saw how Colin turned away at that moment, as if he felt awkward. She said that a person who feels awkward about their own talent is a rarity. In her world, people kill for 1/10 of what he is capable of. Colin asked what kind of world that was. She paused. Then she said one word. The palace. Colin nodded. He knew. He'd known from day one. Leon Varys, Princess of the Empire, 3rd in line to the throne. He didn't know her name, but he knew she was from the palace. From her bearing, from the dagger, by the way she asked questions, like someone accustomed to people telling her the truth out of fear. He asked what she wanted. Leon was silent for a long time. Then she said she wanted something, one single thing that no one had ever done for her. Something just for her personally, not for the princess, not for the 3rd in line, not for a political pawn. For Leon, who, at 12, had chosen a different name for herself and never told anyone what it was. Colin looked at her. She was staring at the floor. For the first time ever, she wasn't controlling her gaze. He said he'd do it, but not a weapon. She looked up. He said he'd make her a seal for her letters, a simple one, a bronze one, with her real name, the one she'd chosen when she was 12. Leon froze. She asked how he knew about the name. Colin said he didn't know, but he could see that she had it. A person hiding behind a false name always carries their true self with them. in their eyes, in the way they flinch when someone accidentally utters a similar sound. Leanne was silent for a minute. Then she quietly said the name. Ellis. She wanted to be Ellis, ever since she was 12. She hadn't told anyone, ever. Colin nodded. 3 days later, he placed a bronze seal in front of her, a small one, still warm from the furnace, with the name Ellis in mirror image, so it would read correctly on wax and sealing wax. Leanne took the seal. She looked at the imprint. Then she sat down on the floor of the smithy, right on the stone slabs. She sat there in silence for a long time. Soyan brought her some tea. She set it down beside her. Then she left. May peeked through the doorway. She saw Leanne on the floor. She looked at Colin. He shook his head. May nodded and left. Leanne sat on the smithy floor for half an hour, with the seal in her hands, with the tea growing cold beside her. She didn't cry. Tears flowed on their own, soundlessly, without a grimace. They just flowed, like water from a repaired roof when it rains for the last time. A year had passed. Colin didn't count by notches, he counted by blades. 23 C-rank blades, 11 B-rank, 4 A-rank, 1 dagger that had chosen its master. The castle household had changed. Not wealthy, not grand, but alive. The forge was in operation every day. Orders came in, not in a flood, just a trickle, but steady. Aiden had grown into a true apprentice. He consistently forged rank D blades and sometimes even reached rank C. His notebook filled with notes from Colin's lessons had become as thick as a brick. He recited the terms Colin explained to him with such a solemn air that the younger boys thought they were spells. Carbonization, austenitization, martensitic transformation. Aiden pronounced them like prayers, and Colin choked on his tea with laughter every time. Haru arrived, the girl from the market, 16 years old, skinny, jittery. Her hair hung over her face like a curtain. She'd been expelled from the House of Grain because any metal she touched began to corrode, to rust, to rot. The masters of Grain House decided she was cursed. Colin saw her at the market. She was sitting on the ground next to a hardware vendor's stall, staring at the nails. Just staring. Colin walked over. He asked what was wrong. She didn't answer. He crouched down beside her. He picked up a nail from the stall. He held it out to her. She recoiled. She told him not to give her metal. She ruins it. Colin didn't pull his hand away. She looked at him. Then she carefully took the nail. Colin activated resonance and placed his hand next to hers, without touching her, listening. And he heard it. Haru wasn't ruining the metal. She could feel its pain, every microcrack, every strain, every hidden flaw. And the metal responded to her attention. It crumbled in the places where it was weak. Like a person who held on for years, and then someone asked how they were doing, and they fell apart. Haru wasn't cursing the metal. She was diagnosing it, forcibly, harshly, but accurately. Colin told her that she didn't have a curse, she had a sense of hearing, just tuned to a different frequency. She can hear where the metal hurts. It's useless in forging, but invaluable in restoration. To find a hidden defect before it becomes fatal. To see a crack that isn't yet a crack. To hear a moan that isn't yet a scream. Haru looked at him from behind her hair. Her eyes were large, distrustful, teary. He told her to follow him. She did. From that day on, Haru lived at the castle house. She slept in the room next to Soyan's. She ate little. She spoke even less. For the first week. Then she started talking, and it was impossible to stop her. She wrote down everything Colin explained to her. in the same notebook Aiden used, only her notes included drawings, detailed, precise. The crystal lattices in her renditions looked like patterns on a rug. A month later, Nia arrived. Huge, a head taller than Colin, broader in the shoulders, dark skin, a deep voice, a southern accent. She entered silently. She stood in the doorway of the forge. She looked at Colin. She pulled a fragment of a blade from behind her belt. It was about the length of her palm. The steel was black with soot. The edge was melted. She said it was her father's blade, the chieftain of the Warren clan. The clan had been destroyed in the Ash Wars. The shard was all that remained. She'd heard that at the House of Castle, they repaired what couldn't be repaired. Colin took the shard.
The resonance echoed heavily, somberly.
This steel remembered fire and blood and screams. It had witnessed the clan's death. It had seen Nia's father fall. It had seen the shard fly into the mud and lie there until Nia found it 3 days later in the ashes. Colin closed his eyes. Then he opened them. He looked at Nia. He told her he couldn't restore the blade in its entirety. There was too little metal left. Too much had been lost. But he could do something else. Nia waited. He said he would fashion the pommel of a new sword from the shard. Her father's blade would become part of her weapon. Not the blade itself, the hilt, the part her hand would rest on. Because her father's blade had served its purpose. It had defended the clan until the very last blow. Now it was her turn. Nia looked at him. Her face was impassive. Then she nodded. Once. Slowly. Colin forged her sword for 2 weeks. Long, heavy, tailored to her height and strength. A broad blade for powerful slashing blows. The pommel made of her father's steel. Black, warm. The resonance wove her father's memory into the new weapon, not as pain, as a foundation. When Nia took the sword, she stood in silence for a long time.
Then she said she would stay.
She didn't ask, she stated it. Colin nodded. Nia became a wall. Not figuratively, literally. She stood between the forge and the world. She guarded. She protected. She joked with an impassive face, so much so that half the team didn't realize it was a joke. She drank tea by the liter. When Colin worked himself to exhaustion, she brought him food and sat down beside him. Silently. No questions, no advice. Just there. And then Rowan arrived. Quiet. Strange. With a last name she couldn't even explain herself. Njolsdottir. She brought a piece of ore. Dark. Heavy. With an iridescent sheen. No one in town could identify it. Colin took the ore in his hand, and the world stood still. A resonance exploded. Not a quiet voice. Not a whisper. A scream. A voice from the depths of millennia. A voice that had been waiting, that had been calling, that had finally been answered. The voice spoke 2 words. You have come. Colin dropped the ore. His hands were shaking. He looked at Rowan. She was looking at him. Her eyes were strange. Not frightened. Recognizing. As if she had heard it too. She said she'd felt her whole life like she didn't belong here,
and she couldn't explain why.
Colin hadn't slept for 3 days after touching Rowan's ore. The voice wouldn't go away. It didn't sound constantly. He waited. Like a man who's sat down in the chair across from you and remains silent, patiently, knowing that sooner or later you'll speak first. On the 4th day, Colin spoke. He picked up the ore, sat down on the floor of the forge. He closed his eyes. He turned resonance up to full power, and he fell, not into the metal, into his memory. He saw Mjol, not ruins, a living city. Huge, built of metal and stone. Towers of steel interwoven with mountain crystal. Workshops on every street. The clang of hammers like music.
thousands of blacksmiths. Each one hears the metal. Each one speaks to it. Each one knows its name. The people of Mjol were not human in the usual sense. They were masters who had become one with their craft. Their blood carried particles of metal. Their bones rang. Their children were born with the hearing that Colin had acquired by chance. They lived for thousands of years. They built. They forged. They created objects that chose their owners, things in which a part of the master's soul lived on.
The SSS-Rank was not a pinnacle for them, but an everyday occurrence.
Then, something came. From beneath the northern ice, from depths older than the world itself. It had no form. It had no voice. It devoured metal. It reduced steel to dust. It turned mithril into dust. It destroyed everything the Mjol had created over millennia. The Ash Rift. It began then, 1,000 years ago, and the Mjol could not stop it, not because they were weak, but because something from the depths fed on their greatest strength. Metal. Every blade they forged provided it with sustenance. Every piece of armor made it stronger. They could not fight it with their own weapons because their weapons fed the enemy. Then, the final Council of Masters made a decision. They could not defeat it, but they could deprive the enemy of its sustenance. They entered the metal, voluntarily. Every Mjol master fused his soul into his final blade. He did not die. He fell asleep. He became part of the steel. Thousands of souls in thousands of blades scattered across the world, hidden in ores and shards and ancient swords. The enemy was deprived of its sustenance. The rift closed. Almost. For 1,000 years, it slept. For 1,000 years, the souls of Mjol waited within the metal. And now, the rift was opening again. Something was awakening. And Colin turned out to be the gateway. The only person in the world who could hear the sleeping masters, and the only one who could lead them back out. But leading them out meant giving the enemy sustenance. Leaving them inside meant condemning thousands of souls to eternal sleep within the cold metal. Colin opened his eyes. The forge, the floor, ore in his hands. Rowan was sitting across from him. She was waiting, silently, as if she knew he would return. Colin looked at her and understood. Mjolsdottir, Mjol's daughter. Her blood carried the same particles. Her surname was no coincidence. She was the last of a line that hadn't gone into the metal, that had remained outside to one day meet the one who would come. He told her everything, not about his transfer, about Mjol, about the voice, about the choice. Rowan listened without surprise, as if she had been waiting her whole life for exactly those words. She said she knew. Not the details, a feeling. She had always felt that the metal around her was alive, that someone was sleeping inside it, that she had to be there when they woke up. Colin assembled a team, all 7 of them, May, Soyeon, Leanne, Haru, Aiden, Nia, Roan. He told them everything, about the rift, about Mjol, about what needed to be done. Not about his own journey from another world. That could wait. They listened. May gripped the hilt of her sword. Soyeon sat motionless. Leanne wrote in her journal. Haru bit her lip. Aiden held his spear with pale fingers. Nia drank tea. Roan looked at the ore in Colin's hands. Colin said he had to forge the final blade, a blade that doesn't kill, a blade that opens a door. He had to melt Roan's ore into it, and through that ore, summon Mjoln. Not outward. Home. To where they had been before they were drawn into the metal. To give them peace. To let them go. And when the last soul departs, something from the depths will be deprived of its sustenance forever. because there will be no metal left in the world with a foreign soul inside it. The rift will close. Not for 1,000 years. Forever. But that meant there would be no more SSS blades. Never. Because an SSS is a blade in which the soul of Master Mjol lives. Without them, metal would remain just metal. Strong, sharp, but not alive. May asked him about her sword, too. Colin paused. Then he said yes. There is an echo in the mithril vein of her blade. Faint, not a full soul, a shadow. But when Mjol is gone, the shadow will be gone too. The sword will remain a sword, rank A, an excellent sword. But not alive. May looked at her blade, at the silvery line running along the spine. Then she looked at Colin. She said she wanted it either way, with a soul or without. Colin nodded. He'd been working on the last blade for a month, every day, from morning till night. Rowan sat beside him. Her presence tripled the resonance. The Mjol blood in her veins responded to the ore. The ore responded to Colin's hammer. 3 voices wove into one. The blade grew slowly, not as a weapon, as a tool, as a key. It was simple, straight, without a guard, without adornments. A blade of ordinary steel, a core of Rowan's ore, a mithril sheath. 3 layers, 3 materials, 3 worlds. Earthen steel, Mjol's metal, mithril, which served as the bridge between them. He finished it on the night of the full moon. Not because the moon influenced the forging, but because on that very night, the resonance rang out loudest. Thousands of voices within the metal across the entire continent. The masters of Mjol sensed that the door was opening. They sang, quietly, expectantly, with hope. Colin took the blade. He stepped out of the forge, the courtyard, moonlight. The whole team stood around him. 7 people, 7 blades. May with a sword, Soyon with a bow, Aiden with a spear, Naya with a heavy blade, Leon with a dagger that Colin had made for her after the seal. Haru was unarmed. She held a notebook. Roan stood beside her. They weren't heading toward the rift. The rift wasn't needed. The blade was the door, and the door was right here. Colin stood in the center of the courtyard. He thrust the blade into the ground. The blade went in easily, like cutting through water. He placed both hands on the hilt. He closed his eyes. He activated resonance. The world opened up. He heard them, all of them, thousands of Mjol craftsmen, in every piece of metal on the continent, in the ancient swords in the treasuries, in the shards buried in the ground, in the ores in the mountains, in the mithril veins beneath the glaciers. They had been waiting for 1,000 years. They were tired. They wanted to go home. Colin didn't command. He didn't order. He didn't force them. He called out. As one calls a friend, as one calls home, simply and quietly. Come on, enough. You've done enough. The blade in the ground glowed, dimly, then brighter. The mithril casing sang. The Rowan ore hummed. The earthen steel trembled. 3 voices merged and became one. And through that voice, a torrent surged. Not light, not energy. Heat. Thousands of warm breaths, thousands of goodbyes, thousands of thank yous. The souls of Mjol were leaving the metal. One by one, by the dozens, by the hundreds. They weren't disappearing. They were returning to where they were before they became masters, to where everyone was before they became anyone. Home. Colin stood and listened. Tears streamed down his face. Every departing soul said goodbye, not with words, with a feeling.
Some gave thanks, some laughed, some cried. One old master lingered a second longer than the others, the very one who had forged the condition 1,000 years ago, the one who had called to Colin through the fire in the Portland workshop. He said one word. It wasn't you who came. Not at last. He said, "Thank you." And he left.
The blade in the ground went dark. Mithril became ordinary silver metal. The ore became ordinary ore. Steel remained steel. Silence. Absolute. Not a single voice in the metal. For the first time since the resonance awoke, Colin stood in a world where the metal was silent. He pulled the blade from the ground. Ordinary, heavy, dead. No, not dead. Silent. The metal hadn't died. It had simply stopped speaking in other voices. Only its own remained. Silent. Honest. Simple. Far to the east, the earth trembled. The ashes vault closed. Something from the depths, deprived of food, fell asleep. This time, forever. Because there was no one left to feed it. Colin sat down on the ground. His legs wouldn't hold him. May was the first to approach. She drew her sword. She looked at it. The silvery line along the spine had faded. The shadow was gone, but the blade remained. The same weight, the same balance, the same edge. His grandfather's steel inside. The mithril vein still there. Just quiet. May sheathed the sword. She looked at Colin. She said it had gone dull. Fix it. Colin laughed, tiredly, happily. He said the kettle was hot. Let her sit down. Morning came slowly, a pink light on the stone walls of the courtyard. The crew sat around the forge, tea in mugs. Silence. A good silence. The silence of people who don't need to speak to be together. Harold came out of the house, old, with a bad back, with hands that had held a hammer for 30 years. He looked at the group by the hearth, at Colin with a blade on his lap, at May, who was sitting nearby and drinking tea, at Soyan in the corner with a bow on her back, at Aidan, who was writing something in a notebook, at Hara, who was sleeping leaning against the wall, at Nia, who was standing by the door watching the sunrise, at Rowan, who was sitting on the floor holding ore in her hands, ordinary ore now. Harold walked over to Colin. He looked down at him. Colin looked up at him. Harold said the roof no longer leaked, that orders were coming in, that the apprentices were learning, that the house of Castle was alive. Then he fell silent, and added one word, for the first time in a year. He said, "Son." Colin nodded. His throat tightened. He nodded again. Then he stood up. He placed the blade on the workbench. He walked over to the forge. He tossed some coals into it. He stoked the fire. He picked up the hammer. A new day. A new job. Without the voices of the ancient masters. Without Mjol's shadow in the metal. Without blades that choose their master. Only steel. Only fire. Only his hands. Only the people for whom he forges. That is enough. A month later, a new sign appeared on the smithy's gate. Not the coat of arms of House Castle. A simple board with letters burned into it. Marsh's Workshop. We repair what cannot be repaired. Kyren Vallenheim arrived a week after the opening. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Colin. He said he had heard about what had happened on the night of the full moon. The entire continent had heard. Every blacksmith had felt how the metal had changed. It had become quieter, simpler, more honest. Kyren said that his blades were no longer perfect. Before, they had been flawless in form and rank. Now he sees that they're missing something. Not skill, something else. He asked Colin to teach him.
Colin shook his head. He said he couldn't teach him how to hear, but he could show him how to listen. Chiron nodded. He took off his cloak, rolled up his sleeves. He picked up a hammer from the workbench and stood at the anvil. Colin smiled. He walked over and placed a piece of steel in front of him. Ordinary steel. Quiet. Honest. Then he said one phrase. Don't strike. Ask. Chiron looked at the steel, then at Colin, then back at the steel. And for the first time in his life, he froze before striking. Not to calculate, to ask a question. In the courtyard, May was sharpening her sword. Soyan sat in the corner with a cup of tea. Aiden was teaching Hara how to sharpen spearheads. Nia stood by the gate, looking out onto the street. Leon was sketching a new sign for the workshop in her journal. Rowan sat on the roof, listening to the wind. Horn was burning. The hammer lay on the anvil. The teapot was hot. The castle house was alive.